The first snowstorm of winter had turned the city streets into a freezing maze of ice and slush. People hurried home with their heads down, wrapping their coats tighter as the icy wind howled through the sidewalks. Outside a busy subway station, a small boy no older than 8 sat alone behind a bus stop, his thin jacket soaked from the snow. His lips trembled, his hands were red from the cold, and he hugged a worn backpack to his chest as hundreds of strangers walked past without stopping. Some glanced at him for only a second before looking away, convincing themselves someone else would help. Across the street, 9-year-old Sophie Miller was returning home after selling handmade flower bouquets with her grandmother. Though her family struggled to pay rent, Sophie had been taught that kindness cost nothing. As she noticed the shivering boy, she immediately put down her basket and ran toward him. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The boy looked frightened but managed to whisper his name. Ethan. He admitted he had been separated from his father after escaping a terrible kidnapping attempt, and he had wandered the streets for hours without knowing where to go. Most people assumed he was just another homeless child. Sophie didn't hesitate. Taking off her own scarf, she wrapped it around Ethan's neck and said, "Come with me. My grandma always says no child should be alone in the cold." Holding his freezing hand, she led him through the snowy streets to their tiny apartment, unaware that Ethan wasn't an ordinary lost boy. He was the only son of Billionaire CEO Jonathan Carter, whose desperate search had already become the city's biggest news story. Neither Sophie nor her grandmother could imagine that one simple act of kindness would change all of their lives forever. Sophie led Ethan through the snow-covered streets until they reached a tiny apartment above an old bakery where she lived with her grandmother, Margaret. The apartment was small, with peeling paint and worn furniture, but it was warm and filled with love. As soon as Grandma Margaret saw Ethan shivering in the doorway, she rushed to wrap him in a thick blanket and placed a bowl of hot chicken soup in front of him. The little boy ate quietly, his hands still trembling from the cold. Sophie sat beside him, smiling gently as if he had always been part of their family. Later that evening, Ethan slowly opened up. He remembered getting separated from his father after 2 masked men tried to force him into a van outside his school. During the chaos, he escaped and wandered for hours through unfamiliar streets before the freezing weather left him exhausted and frightened. Meanwhile, across the city, Billionaire CEO Jonathan Carter was living every parent's worst nightmare. His private security team searched every neighborhood while police officers, helicopters, and television stations broadcast Ethan's photograph nationwide. A reward of $5 million was offered for any information leading to the boy's safe return. Yet Sophie and her grandmother never saw the news because their old television had stopped. Working months earlier, they simply believed they were helping a lost child who needed warmth and safety. That night, Ethan slept peacefully for the first time since disappearing, tucked into Sophie's own bed while she happily slept on the couch. Before turning off the light, Grandma Margaret quietly whispered, "Sometimes God sends people into our lives for a reason." None of them realized that by sunrise, the desperate search for the missing CEO's son was about to lead the police directly to their humble little home, changing their lives forever. Just after sunrise, loud knocks echoed through the apartment. Grandma Margaret opened the door to find several police officers standing beside men in black suits, wearing security badges. Sophie's heart raced as Ethan stepped forward, recognizing one of the security guards. Moments later, a convoy of black SUVs stopped outside the building. A tall man in an expensive overcoat rushed out before the vehicles had fully stopped. Tears filled his eyes as he saw Ethan standing safely in the doorway. "Dad!" Ethan cried, running into his father's arms. Jonathan Carter, one of the country's most powerful CEOs, held his son tightly, unable to speak through his emotion. For 2 days, he had feared he would never see his child again. The police explained that surveillance footage and Ethan's description had finally led them to the neighborhood. Jonathan turned toward Sophie and her grandmother with overwhelming gratitude. They were stunned to learn that the frightened little boy they had welcomed into their tiny home was the missing son whose face had appeared on every news channel. Jonathan tried to hand Grandma Margaret a check for $5 million, the reward he had promised, but she gently pushed it back. "We didn't help Ethan for money," she said softly. "Any child deserves a warm meal, a safe bed, and kindness." Her words left everyone speechless. Jonathan had spent years surrounded by people who valued his wealth more than his heart, yet this poor family had asked for nothing in return. Looking around the modest apartment, he noticed the broken television, the worn furniture, and Sophie's patched winter coat. Despite having so little, they had shared everything they had with a stranger. At that moment, Jonathan made a quiet promise to himself. He would never forget the family whose kindness had saved his son, and he was determined to repay them in a way they could never imagine. A week later, Jonathan Carter invited Sophie and Grandma Margaret to the headquarters of Carter Industries. Nervous and wearing their cleanest but simplest clothes, they stepped into the magnificent glass skyscraper, where hundreds of employees welcomed them with applause. Jonathan stood before the entire company with Ethan by his side. Holding back tears, he told everyone how a 9-year-old girl had done what hundreds of strangers had failed to do. "When my son was freezing and alone," Jonathan said, "people walked past him. But one little girl with almost nothing opened her heart and saved his life." The room fell silent before erupting into applause. Jonathan then revealed his surprise. He established the Sophie Miller Foundation, a charity dedicated to helping homeless and missing children, naming Sophie as its honorary ambassador. He purchased a beautiful home for Sophie and her grandmother, ensuring they would never worry about rent again. Grandma Margaret received lifetime financial security, while Sophie was awarded a full educational scholarship through university. But Jonathan's greatest gift wasn't money. He invited Sophie and Grandma Margaret to become part of Ethan's life, saying they would always be family. The children quickly became inseparable, spending weekends together, celebrating birthdays, and sharing adventures like brother and sister. Years later, Sophie graduated with honors and chose to lead the very foundation created in her name, helping thousands of children find safety, shelter, and hope. Whenever reporters asked Jonathan what inspired his charity work, he smiled and pointed toward Sophie. "A billionaire didn't save my son," he would say. "A little girl with a kind heart did." Sophie always remembered the freezing winter evening when she simply stopped to help someone everyone else ignored. That single act of kindness transformed not only Ethan's future but her own as well, proving that the greatest heroes are often ordinary people who choose compassion when everyone else chooses to walk away.